Hello everyone and welcome to Moneyline with Nancy. I am Nancy Naji. You might be wondering, where is she? She's not in the studio actually. I am not in the studio, but today I'm at the Nigerian Economic Summit group, Nigerian Economic Summit. At the Nigerian Economic Summit, I moderated two important sessions, and the two sessions are around the National Child Well-Being Dialogue. That's one, the policy debate. The second one is the ministerial roundtable. And why are these sessions very important? Now, let me read out some statistics to you watching so that you understand the importance of why this program, which you'll be watching, it's important. We talk about Nigeria's economy, we talk about let's make money, we talk about rebuilding Nigeria's economy, we talk about foreign exchange, we talk about inflation, we talk about a whole lot of stuff. How are all those things also impacting the Nigerian child? When we talk about human capital, we need to build our human capital. Where does it really start from? Of course, there's a proverb that comes to my mind that says, it takes a village to raise a child. Now, the importance of a child well-being dialogue in Nigeria is very important. And why is it important? We must be cognizant of what happens from the birth of a child to cradle, to when that child turns into a toddler, to when that child becomes now a child, to when that child turns into an adolescent, then youth, then a full adult. And let me also remind us that the median age of Nigeria is 18 years old. That is the median age. So if Nigeria is supposed to be one person, that person will be an 18-year-old person. And that is why this conversation is very important. Now, listen to some of the statistics. 1 in 3 children in Nigeria is denied the opportunity to attend school. And we have about 10.2 million at primary school, 8.1 million at the junior secondary school. Shockingly, 4 million women give birth without skill, attendance, and risking their lives as well as the lives of their newborn. If we're talking about malnutrition, about 35 million Nigerian children, 35 million, that is the population of many countries in Africa. Zambia is like 16 million, Gambia is like 2 million, you have Zimbabwe, so you take like that 35 million, you can aggregate it to about 5-6 countries, and that's the population of some African countries. And yet in Nigeria, we have 35 million children under the age of 5 that is stunted. So as an economy, we are producing stunted children. Now, equally concerning is that 21 million children under 5 lack legal identity. And what do I mean by this? They do not have birth certificates. So let me just stop right now with those sobering statistics for us to ruminate with. And let me take you to the policy debate, the first policy debate, which I moderated, for us to enumerate the challenges and most importantly, come up with solutions. So just take a listen. Okay, good morning again. Good morning, distinguished panelists. I would begin by asking what your views are. First of all, Ms. CRISTIAN has given us a background. And I was watching the body language of not just you, but also the rest of the room when that presentation was on. Mrs. UWAIS, let me start from you. You're just the immediate past special advisor to the president on social investment. These are numbers that you're familiar with. These are numbers that you were advocating for the past how many years for us to get better at. Are we getting worse?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me and having this audience. This is a very critical conversation, and I thank NESD for prioritizing the issue of child well-being for the first time. The numbers are quite dismal, but it doesn't help that our population is growing in leaps and bounds. So the more you try, the more it's harder for you to catch up. You know, and it doesn't help also that we have different states doing their own thing. There's hardly any coordination. Everybody is attempting to do what they can in their own way. So I really think we need to have some coordinating body to ensure that there are standards, and we try to, we aspire to hit those targets. It doesn't help that we're not actually trying to understand why these things happen, and the advocacy needs to target those issues. One of the reasons why we have these high numbers, especially in the north, is child marriage. We have little children getting pregnant because they're married, and they don't have a choice. And the fetus doesn't ask for permission. It just grabs what it can from the body of the mother. And at the end of the day, the majority of malnourished children come from malnourished mothers. It doesn't help that we focus, and I'm not downgrading education. I'm saying we need to upgrade health, mental health. We need to work in a more wholesome manner, because we can't just target education. We can't just target infrastructure. We need to work in a manner that prioritizes all of these things, especially for out-of-school children. Out-of-school children don't have the same comfort of a structured family. They're out there looking for food. You know, there are a lot of mental health issues that we seem to be oblivious to. Those issues can actually truncate whatever education you want to give these children. So the focus on infrastructure is good, because we don't have enough infrastructure. But when we don't look at the other softer issues, you can build the best, first-class school in a community if you don't address the poverty issues. The classrooms remain empty because the children go to the farm or go to hawk. And so we need to look at the insecurity issues, the training of teachers. Unfortunately, these issues are they're not visible, they're not tangible. So the problem we have is the public servants, the governors, they want to see something tangible. In a 4-year term, they want to see what they can point at and say, it's my legacy. But we need to talk about monitoring and make it a priority also, so that we know a governor, even if it takes 3 years for outcomes to be positive, we need to demonstrate that it's important that, this is what has happened in terms of maternal mortality, what has happened, because you can't just do it in one, you have to look at the entire picture.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Shina, let me come to you, and dovetailing from what Mrs. UWAIS has said, Ms. CRISTIAN in her presentation did say earlier that 8 million children are born every year into Nigeria. And I saw your reaction, Mrs. UWAIS, when she said that, that situation, 8 million children in the country every year, does it make the matter worse? How is that contributing that we may not be able to achieve the SDGs by 2030? It's not that I'm pessimistic, but if you go by the numbers and you do your mappings and all of that, it doesn't take a scientist to know that if we're going down this road without improvement, we're going to hit the rocks.
Thank you, moderator, and also thanks to our wonderful audience as well. I think that I'll speak to that question in 3 parts, right? And first is 8 million or not, the question is, in what context are those kids born into? That's number one, right? And we've seen the context. It's abysmal, right? That's one. I think the second point that I'll speak is, are we treating this as an emergency? Because what I saw in that statistics connotes to me a real emergency on our hands as a country, right? And I think the third point to that make is, within the context that we have, are we doing all that we can to make sure that this emergency is dealt with everything we've got? And not just the government, but the private sector as a whole, right? The communities, the traditional leaders. It has to be a collective effort at what we need to be doing to drive this. And now let's go back to your question, which is 8 million, is that scary? Should that worry us? Yes, it should, within the context that we are and the statistics that we've seen. But more importantly, I think the question should then be, how are we preparing to make sure that we can galvanize all the necessary resources and gallop towards changing that dynamics?
Okay, before I come to the next question, let's please recognize the presence of the Honourable Minister of Women Affairs in our midst, Mrs. Uju Kennedy. Please, can we give her a round of applause? Her ministry is very integral in what we are talking about, because this 8 million children that are being born every year in Nigeria are born by mothers. So we should actually prioritize issues that surround women in Nigeria. So thank you very much, Honourable Minister, for coming to grace this occasion. Dr. Tayo, let's talk about perhaps the hard conversation, still talking about Ms. CRISTIAN's presentation, because watching her presentation, a lot was running through my mind. The 8 million children born into Nigeria every year. Is it time for us to have that hard conversation about population control? How are we going to look at that? Because we have religious, cultural challenges to that.
Yeah, so the numbers jade you. It actually shocks you if out of whatever slumber you're in, because the Nigerian child is at risk at scale. We have an industrial scale level of child crisis. All we are dealing with is so existential to the survival of our future that the fact that we are not in a hurry to fix it is almost a sign that we are a country of irresponsible adults. Let's not kid ourselves. If you say a child is raised by a village, this village is full of irresponsible adults. This is a crisis. We are dealing with an emergency, and adults are walking around behaving as if nothing is happening. We're treating this as if there is a tomorrow. For goodness sake, there is no tomorrow. 20 million at-risk children today means 20 million adults plus their children in 5-10 years. That's 100 million. Look, by 2050, you're discussing 420 million. 220 of them are young. Of those young ones, from these numbers we're seeing, 78% of them will be disadvantaged significantly to compete in any way in terms of human capital competitiveness. So the child at risk is a human capital competitiveness issue. There is a business case for paying attention. It's not tokenism, it's not penance, it's not handouts, we are in a crisis, and the crisis does not need more talking. We need to be able to make commitments about the number of children that we're going to school this year, next year. We need to be able to make commitments about how we will put more girl children out of this social trap. Prisons, literally. We were in 17 states on the ACP program, basically tracking learning poverty. And we ran into child mothers who, by 18, 19, have been through 4 marriages and are now with no husband and with 4 children in this country. In the South, we ran into child brides where fathers sell the children because they say it's safer to sell the child into a marriage than to keep a child that dies of hunger or is raped at the worst and then has a child they cannot take care of. We are dealing with existential issues where the truth is that there are no answers that does not require the collective capacity of society to respond. So one is there is a business case for the child. 2, it's a human capital competitiveness issue. I mean, Zoara pointed it very aptly. 1,000 days of a child with permanent cognitive damages caused by malnutrition, which, by the way, is at 32% of under 5s, means that 32% of our under 5s are potentially cognitively disadvantaged at under 5, and we will never be able to compensate for that deficit as adults. Then we are hoping for a digitally connected industrial Nigeria with which workforce? So the challenge is we are not getting the connection. There is a connection between our economic competitiveness and the quality of our human capital. That is what the numbers say. It says we are in a crisis, treat it now, not tomorrow. Now, as a crisis, the child can't wait. The child can't wait for 1 more year, 4 more years, 5 more years. No, the child has to be responded to across their multiple deprivations today. And what the data shows us, if the SDGs are about leaving no one behind, what the data tells us is that we have left the children behind. And we've left them behind at scale. Of 123 multidimensionally poor Nigerians, 80 million are children. 80 million are children. And we are moonwalking through a disaster, behaving as if it doesn't matter. So I think why the NESG has centered this conversation in the middle of an economic summit, which, by the way, some business leaders asked me, come, this thing you're bringing here, what is it about? It's about economics. If a demographic transition has occurred, which means from now through the next 30 years, Nigeria will be younger by size of population. And what we have done is we have now structured the country to be unprepared for translating this younger demographic into a competitive human capital that can make Nigeria great. We've all failed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tayo. And as you're saying this, I'm really having goosebumps around me because I'm trying to juxtapose all of us here in the room. We have children, we are aunties, we are uncles, we're fathers, we're moms. What kind of upbringing, what kind of future are we giving to our children as against the millions of children out there and people thinking for them? Ms. CRISTIAN, let me come back to you. We've laid a background now from your presentation, but what critical policy priorities do you think that we should swiftly do now to boost child health, education, as well as protection of children in Nigeria, given that we are lagging behind in the 2030 SDG indicators?
Thank you. First, I think that the best way to show that there is a political will towards realizing children's rights, meaning giving the child an opportunity to live, to thrive, and to develop, is the best way to show that is for real is on the budget. The budget assignation, the policy to set the budget, meaning that at this moment it is really way below, we would say below the international standards, but I think it is way below the millions of children that are suffering in Nigeria. It is not enough. So if we go very technically and evidence-based, maths cannot, give us the equation. What the country is actually investing in health, nutrition, education, water and sanitation is not enough, not even to cope with the 10% of the magnitude of the problem. So that is one. The other one, I think, it is to set on a yearly basis clear results. Because when we are just talking about policies, they might become too general. A policy saying, well, we guarantee health for all children. But if we are not addressing those 2 million children that are there without a vaccine, and we cannot say this year we reach 1 million and the second year we reach the 2 million, we cannot say we are solving problems. So it is a need to clearly state what the result will be. And third, the quality of what is given should improve. And this comes with efforts on capacity building, institutional strengthening, strengthening the human resources of government. And here you have this debate, at times it says, but why investing in strengthening the capacity of the government? Well, the government structure, I'm not saying infrastructure, the government structure is the only one who has those thousands of schools there, thousands of health posts, thousands of human power to deliver. The point is how they can deliver with the necessary resources, with quality, and with accountability, which brings me to a very robust accountability framework where we can say that every naira that is placed for the social services for children are really invested in the most efficient and effective way.
Mrs. UWAIS, over to you, dovetailing from also what she said in terms of tangible results. And I also know that for us to have those tangible results, they have to come even at the subnational levels, because these numbers also at the subnational levels. So with your experience, how can state governments actively reduce child poverty and also ensure fair access to vital services for children across regions in Nigeria? You mentioned what is actually on in the north. Every region has something peculiar. You will get to see, okay, in the north, the children don't go to school. Perhaps in the south, some go to school, they drop out, and they're hawking on the road. So how do we begin to ask the hard questions and ensure that results are done at the state levels?
Thank you, Nancy. The challenge is, the highest numbers, if you look at the statistics, are in the north. This is why I mentioned it. And if you can address a lot of those issues, you will actually have the challenges that we have. But this is not to say that there aren't other challenges that are peculiar. This is why I said targeted advocacy. It's very important to understand the nuances in each state and go down to the communities, engage community leaders, traditional rulers, influential, very, assertive leaders in the community, get them to understand, link the dots. Why is this happening? Many of them don't understand that the reason why there's poverty is because the girl child is not educated. And once you can do the advocacy in a manner that brings it forth, nobody wants to live in poverty. You talk to them and they now begin to nod their heads. Look at me, I come from a village, I went to school, and this is the only reason why I'm where I am. And so there are a lot of things that come with an education and well-being that does not, hit us. So targeted advocacy, strategic communication, and we need to deal with the hard issues. Those hard issues, many people don't want to. A lot of politicians don't want to talk about early marriage. And they feel it's because of religious purposes, but strict religious interpretation would show that no religion sanctions injustice. And this is injustice to the little girl. So we really need to begin to talk about things. You mentioned population control. Yeah. We need the data at community level. We need to be able to monitor. We need to make the parents and the community understand the difference it makes. And so we need to give incentives if necessary, because these children, give them short-term, benefits by going to hawk and bring 200 naira or 100 naira a day. But for them, that is what they can see. And you need to make them understand that long-term, they will bring you much more than what they're bringing today. But you just need to be patient. And some of these parents, you need to engage them directly. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done at advocacy level, at community level, but also in terms of policy because tendency, from what I have seen, is at federal level, we think we can do it, we can't. It has to be, the mandate is at, the constitutional mandate is at state level, and the state governors need to be brought on board, and maybe it's the president that needs to summon all of this and get them to understand. In some states, out-of-school children are even higher, the numbers, than children in school. You know, it's crazy.
Okay. This is just, you know, this session is such an emotional one for me, and I don't know why it's beginning to turn so. I hope I don't begin to cry in this session, you know, because we know it's a serious situation, it's a crisis, but we need to attend to it with the urgency of now, just like Dr. Tayo mentioned earlier. I will come back to you, Mrs. UWAIS, because you talked about advocacy. And the question I want to ask you around advocacy is, what have we been doing in the last how many years? What kind of advocacy? Because government will say it's doing advocacy. What is the coloration of that advocacy? But ruminate on that question. I will come back to you later. Dr. Tayo, let me come back to you and ask you that question also in terms of the kind of commitment we should begin to see from the states and governments, because they have the responsibility to be able to reduce this, if not eradicate it. What specifics do you expect state governments to come up with to reduce child poverty? Because you said it's actually a business case, you know, and it should be a business case even for the state governments. Because it's not just about we're driving foreign direct investments into our states, but your human capital is zero.
So it seems to me that the child crisis requires several layers. Some layers are there. So at the federation level, in 2017, the president of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was in Nigeria, addressed the National Economic Council that the Nigerian human capital was at risk. And I remember that the resolution of that council meeting was an investment in human capital agenda for the entire National Economic Council, all 36 states plus the FCT. Following that meeting, some of us in the room, so the Office of the Vice President, UNICEF, Gates, World Bank, NESG, were all invited into a meeting where we now formed something called the Human Capital Development Co-working Group. Within that co-working group, we agreed as institutional partners of the National Economic Council, and as the 36 governors, that it was crucial to reach a framework for capturing targets that all the state governments agreed on. And so together, we created a national strategy on human capital development. The co-working group took it back to the National Economic Council. We got approval. I think my sister, Yosola Akombish, is somewhere in the audience. Yosola, can you wave? Okay. Yeah, so she's sitting to your right. And so she was the person from the vice president office that ultimately became the coordinator of the co-working group. Now, what has happened is that we have, together with UNICEF and the other partners, set very clear dashboards with targets, programmatic design for all the 36 states. We went as far as regional consultations with the state governments to create HCD councils, where these targets, the states were supposed to now go down, do consultations with their local governments, agree on what the targets are, and bring back up. Because we felt, the point Madam UWAIS was making, that none of us can simply sit in Abuja here and mandate that the child will not be at risk. It's impossible. Now, what has happened is that you have political transition. And unfortunately, whilst the CWG was in the process of strengthening many of these institutions, we're back to where 1/3 of the entire federation has new chief executives of federating units. So we're basically starting a re-advocacy to new sheriffs across the country on why this is important. And so this goes to Christine's point about the strength of institutions. However, at federal, we have not seen actions at scale where the ministers coordinate in a way where the child is the center of the nexus. What we are saying is, one, we need to see the National Economic Council take ownership of its HCD scorecard and mandate for the reporting that comes from the 36 states up. We need to see a federal executive council, sub-council on the child, or HCDs, that meets regularly around clear actions, targets, reporting and accountability tied to budget. Which is why we hope that the honorable ministers will join us for the next session, which is in about an hour, to have a ministerial dialogue where we will not be the ones talking or debating, but the ministers will be up here and will be down there, I think it's in the Benway Hall, where we can put them to task. Because the truth is, Nigeria must get the message, and I think that's the purpose of this session, but the ministers must come along and make those commitments. Now, coordination, we think should happen. Now, there's now an honorable minister, coordinating minister for social welfare. We think that the honorable minister for coordination minister for social welfare should coordinate this sub-cabinet of ministers to now pursue clear targets and objectives in health, in education. The last point is there's what we call spaces for transformation. Madam UWAIS and I call it learning spaces. In the HCD, CWG, we called them the centers for intervention. So where does the child live? If you get the child to school, the school becomes a center for transformation. Because you can get food to school, you can get vaccination to school, you can get some of the support we need to school. Some communities is not school. School is not the safest place. So we then have to create safe spaces. Now, with safe spaces, it becomes a community conversation as to where to situate that. So I think what we need to see is coordinated actions targeted at intervention spaces. Intervention spaces must be safe for the child. What this means in certain socio-cultural contexts in Nigeria is that where we have situated the traditional school will not work for the girl child. Because in certain communities, the girl child can't simply wander to school by herself that is 3 kilometers away. So safe spaces for targeted interventions is something that the collective stakeholders must agree about. The last is conditional interventions. And I know this is a debate within the UN system about what interventions should be conditional or not conditional. If we want, the current government wants to do 15 million cash transfers, right, to 15 million households. We think that head of households that get those transfers should commit that if you're going to get transfers from government, send your child to school, right? Get your child vaccinated. We think there must be a better connection between government interventions on the social investment side and meeting some of these outcomes. If I give the head of household additional cash, which should allow the head of household free the child up to go to school, I need to see that that is happening simultaneously. We have 28 million unregistered child deaths in Nigeria. So, for example, if we said access to credit for maybe a smallholder farmer woman meant show your child's birth certificates or something, then it forces them to register the child. But we must see ministers coordinate, and this is where coordination is important, to agree that if we want to save the child, we can't walk alone. It's not Ministry of Education, it's not Ministry of Health, it's not Ministry of Women Affairs. All of them asking, how do we use these centers and spaces of intervention and arrive there together?
Okay. I actually wanted even the Minister of Women Affairs to make a remark, but she earlier told me that she has another session which she wanted, because I wanted her to also at least chip in a word since she was here with us a few minutes. But like you said, Dr. Tayo, after this policy debate, we all transit to the Benway room for the ministerial roundtable. But Dr. ALADESHEWA, how can international community support positive change? especially around the issues which we're dealing with right now, to ensure that Nigeria-centered development moves, not just the snail speed that we're seeing right now. What kind of wisdom can we draw from global successes? When Dr. Tayo was talking about cash transfer attached to certain conditions, Brazil came to my mind with Bolsa Familia of many years ago, and we saw how Bolsa Familia, which is a cash transfer program, helped move people out of poverty and even ensured that more children went to school. So in that context, what wisdom can we draw? It's not that that wisdom is not even there, actually, coming to think of it. It's there, but what's making us not, embark on such interventions? Are we such a difficult people?
Right. Thanks, Nancy. I think there are like a couple of things that we need to be sort of cognizant of, right? So first is, like you said, it's not that that will isn't there. Because, I mean, the startup to this conversation was a clear presentation by an international organization. So we understand this problem. And the international organization is engaging very closely with the government to solve this problem. But I think that Tayo mentioned a couple of very interesting points that I would like to sort of latch onto and sort of bring to light just again, right? One of them is, how do you elevate this conversation about child well-being, right, to the highest level of governance in an institutional and systematic strategic way, right? Meaning it doesn't matter what government of the day there is, but there's a system that this is part of and is not dropping. When no government comes and drops the ball on this. That's number one. Number two is, I'll use an example that says, if as a person, you're very clear the direction you need to go, it's easier for you to get other people along to join you. So as a country, and again, going back to our governance system, right, we need to say very clearly and be clear about what is our strategic focus, what is our direction about child well-being, and then we can galvanize the kind of support that the international organization can bring to bear, right, to help drive that along into stuff. For instance, we have only a few years to 2030. We are behind abysmally from all the statistics. The question is, what do we need to do today as a country to set our targets right and get everybody aligned behind that target and driving in one concerted effort towards that goal for 2020, for 2030? That's one. The second piece in my mind is, what is the government doing to incentivize even the private sector as well? In such a way that you can have the private sector work with international communities, but also work with the local government, not just at the national, but at the subnational level, but even beyond subnational. So think about subnational as having multiple points. The state, the wards, the local government, even within the local government, the community level, where one of our panelists has been saying all morning is about all of the negatives about child labor, child marriages. They're down there at the lowest level. How do you make sure that you, as a government of the day, is galvanizing everybody towards those conversations and having them? I'll wrap up by saying two other things. It's easy to have targets, right? To have strategies and to have plans. What has been a big issue, and not just with what we're discussing now, but generally across board, is accountability and performance management. So you have all of this in place, but how do you honestly ensure that they work the way they are supposed to work? Who is going to, at the end of the day, say, I own up to the fact that if this fails, it is my fault. I'm responsible for that. How do you make sure that somebody at every level is owning up to each of those things and asking questions about why are we not moving in the right direction or at the speed we imagine that we'll be moving at, and what can we be doing to solve the problem now?
Okay, Mrs. UWAIS, over to you. We just have a few minutes to be here. We'll continue the conversation definitely at the Benway Hall, and I think questions. But before we move, Mrs. UWAIS, we've been talking now about the big elephant in the room, and let us address it. The big elephant in the room is extracting a strong political will and political commitment. The question is now, how do we fortify the political will? Dr. Aduloju mentioned earlier, the work you all did for a long time, dismantled, you had new people, you had to start explaining again. So how do we fortify political will that perhaps when another administration comes, there is an institutionalized political will, that new people will come and, yes, and just key in into that. Is there something we can do around that?
Well, sorry, just before we go into that, I need to sound a word of caution. Having worked in many communities in Nigeria, the problem also is that the services may not be there. We have a lot of communities that don't have schools. We have a lot of communities that don't have primary healthcare centers. NIMSI is not everywhere. You understand? So tying conditions to cash transfers may actually defeat the purpose. I think we need to do a lot of work in terms of engaging them and making them understand the importance of doing certain things, ensuring their children can aspire to be bigger than they are, bringing a lot of these necessities to the place. And that is also something the private sector can do, something that the government can do, the state government and the local government. A lot of them are dropping the ball. So putting burdens, I would say, you must do certain things. If we can understand that teaching under a tree is acceptable, if there's no infrastructure within 2 kilometers, for instance, that is something we need to adjust our minds to, because we have no control, really. I think, coming back to your question, the president needs to seize the momentum now. He's got new ministers in. Thankfully, he's got a very efficient Minister for Health who is now coordinating all of this. It's important that they put in a matrix, but also strategically targeting each and every state and also down to the local governments. Let's see how far they can go. Let there be a framework based on the deficits that they see in every state, and let's see how we can measure, we can collate the data, we can measure, and also remove the bottlenecks, because there is a lot of, there are many challenges there that may be in the mindset, certain random people saying certain things that are totally unfounded. Let's see how we can target that in a more, but we also need the states on board, because the states do the implementation. We don't have the right from federal government to do that. But getting the right kind of people at state level, that's another issue. The people at state level need to buy into this. It's beyond a budget issue. There's a lot that can be done, because even the budget, I watched it, and a lot of it gets wasted. There are many loopholes that we can plug. People go in there and make money. This is the sad reality, and because these children don't have voices, they can't speak up, so we need to have some kind of accountability matrix to ensure that the money is getting to the community, and we're addressing the challenges that the community has itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. UWAIS. Dr. ALADESHEWA, we're still sticking with that question. How do we now encourage synergy among critical stakeholders to prioritize child-centered development? Because the stakeholder we're talking about now is government, but there are also other critical stakeholders. How do we encourage synergy amongst them?
So I think it's three things. I think that it starts with, first of all, directing the right kind of advocacy to the right groups and the right audiences. And I think that one must really thank the organizers of this event for placing this at the very act of the conversation and at a critical moment as well. And that critical moment is that there are a lot of changes within the public sector right now, and it's important that conversations like this are top agenda. And so this is critical. So things like this, number one, for sure. I think the second most important thing is, again, I said it before, governance at the highest level, yes, but So what's the right incentives, right? For instance, for the private sector, I'll give a very good example, right? If you remember the period of the COVID emergency, somehow there was a strong buy-in by the private sector. And the governance, right, there was some incentive. They came in, we could see action real time, right? The question is, I think maybe because this was serious global emergency, but we have serious national emergency here, right? And so how does the government incentivize the private sector to get on board? For second. And I think the third is the international organizations, the local stakeholders, which I think are critical, traditional rulers, right? Household heads, community leaders. What is the right way to actually get them to think? I mean, one way has been suggested, which is, can you condition things? But maybe that won't work in every level. What are the other incentives to get those critical stakeholders engaged? You know why? That's exactly the level of implementation. That's where things need to change, and this is what we need to be preaching and advocating for.
Okay, Dr. Tayo, very quickly, with the current Nigerian development context, what immediate actions can be utilized to enhance child human capital? And how can we implement them on a large scale? I was listening to the president's speech yesterday. When I got home, I also read it. I read it and I noticed that paragraph 14 was where the president talked about human capital and a little bit of semblance of child there. And when I was playing back what he mentioned here on stage, I was like, okay, there's this hope of building, of getting a $1 trillion economy for Nigeria. I almost jumped up from where I was seated and I said, Mr. President, are you thinking of the human capital, the children, which we are producing now? So how do we go about all of this in terms of making a child the center of human capital? Because that's actually where it begins. From birth, that's actually where it begins.
So, one, I think we need a national campaign that changes minds and hearts, and we need to get on board that campaign champions that are reflective of our cultural diversity and sustain that campaign for a long time. The reason is that cultural transformation is difficult because it's deeply seated in historic, ethnic, tribal, social norms, roles, and constructs. And when you run against it, the first thing people say is they put that in front of you. Once you break it down, there were communities where we did some learning work at the NESG in where the matriarchs, who are viewed as the mothers of the sons, are the most powerful advocates, right? And when they say it will stand, it stands in those communities. We need to think of a national advocacy program that has different layers where we are using the strongest voices to bring down the walls, where the walls are. And the different geopolitical zones have different socio-cultural contexts that have unique barriers. It's not the same across Nigeria. So a one-fit-all for the child will not work. Now, this then takes us to the Governors Forum. The Governors Forum has regional Governors Forums that could form the basis of a way to reach regional consensus of what works best, for example, in the Northeast versus the South-South. We must see advocacy that allows consensus to come out from there also, because children move. I remember His Excellency Nasir El-Rufai, when he came in his first term, started this program of getting all the children off the streets. I remember I was at a brainstorming meeting and we thought to ourselves, I think the total number of children on the streets in Kaduna was about 3-point-something million. Once the program was implemented and we got the children off the streets in Kaduna, all the children off the streets elsewhere, all around him, migrated to Kaduna. So by the way, it tells you that the children also know what's good for them. Therefore, you can't solve this problem with one state doing it by itself. Anyways, sooner or later, the spillover of all the children or parents thinking that's a better place for my child will happen. So this regional coordination allows for us to deal with the spillover effects of that kind of program. And then sociocultural contexts. From the private sector point of view, my vice chair, Mr. Bowie, on the SDG panel pointed out that one of the things the private sector has done is many of us have now advocated and integrated into our corporate strategy a sustainability strategy. Within our sustainability strategy, private sector corporates identify our two types of basic investment, either our social investments or our corporate social responsibility investments. And in some cases, we do a double. We pursue a philanthropic investment that has an economic impact side. So it's a blend. But most corporates represented at NESG have at least one of the three. CSR, social investments, philanthropic investments, and then the blend. What we've now said is, can you come along and sit with, and Yosola is the biggest person at bullying me for this, can you tell them to come and look at the programs that we and the states have agreed, and rather than go do your CSR as a separate thing, bring your money and fit it into a program that already has, commitment, connection with the locals. So there's an ACP that already works in certain states at community level. It's tied to the Ministry of Poverty Reduction. It has UNICEF support as well. Bring yours along and make that scale. So when we are discussing solutions at scale and mobilizing the collective capacity of society, we must become better at showcasing the programs that are working and that might be able to work at scale. So with the NERC CWG, we have what we call a portfolio of workable programs that are implementable at scale. We then have invited corporates to come along and look at that entire portfolio to say, come, if you're a corporate here and your CSR is focused on health, come and look at this portfolio of existing programs that already work, already has a model, has a structure, has implementers, and invest in this one on education or health or vaccination or zero-dose children. And then it allows us to now mobilize our resources in a way where they are heading towards the same set of outcomes, but simultaneously responding to the unique contextual, structural, and social differences across the country. That's how I think we'll achieve scale.
What more can I say? You've heard it all, especially from the experts there on the panel session. This is the much I can take today because there was so much that went on, so many revelations, so many recommendations, and also solutions to this problem. Mr. President at the summit did talk about that is his intention to raise Nigeria's human capital, is his intention to have a country of $1 trillion economy, all well and good, but we must actually also think about our children. So this is where we'll leave it for today. Be the best you can be and be the change that you want to see. I am Nancy Nnaji, saying bye.